Welcome to another deep dive with Vet Neurojar. We've got quite a case study to dig into today from the Journal of Feline Medicine and Surgery Open Reports. This one is all about a rare neurological condition, called Dyke-Davidoff-Masson-like syndrome, or DDMS, in a cat.
And what's particularly interesting about this case is that the cat started showing symptoms suddenly as an adult.
Yeah, that's pretty unusual, right? Because DDMS is usually associated with a brain injury, like early in life. So seeing it appear so abruptly in a grown cat, well, that raises a lot of questions.
Absolutely, it does. It definitely challenges what we typically understand about DDMS and how it progresses.
Okay, so let's meet our patient. We've got a 4-year-old male domestic short-hair cat from Romania. And according to the owners, he had always been a bit clumsy, but then he suddenly started showing some pretty concerning neurological symptoms.
That clumsiness you mentioned, that's a really interesting detail. It could suggest that there was a subtle neurological deficit present all along, something that maybe went unnoticed until those more severe symptoms emerged.
That makes sense. It reminds us that even those little quirks in our pet's behavior, they might actually be signs of something more serious going on.
Right, exactly. Especially if those quirks start to change or worsen over time.
Definitely something to watch out for. Okay, so let's talk about the more alarming symptoms that this cat started exhibiting. He was experiencing ataxia.
Ataxia, which is basically a lack of coordination.
Yeah, right, like a wobbly gait.
Exactly. And he was also had rapid involuntary eye movements called nystagmus.
And he was vomiting too.
Yes. And on top of that, the cat also showed a lack of menace response in one eye, meaning he didn't blink when something quickly moved towards his eye, which suggests there might be an issue with the central nervous system.
Oh, wow. And to add to that, the vets also observed that he had increased extensor tone in his left legs and decreased tone in his right legs.
All those findings really pointed towards a problem within the central nervous system, possibly in the areas that control balance and coordination, like the cerebellum or the vestibular system.
So, to figure out what was going on, they ran a whole bunch of tests. But his blood work came back normal.
And tests for feline immunodeficiency virus and feline leukemia virus were negative as well.
But then they did a CT scan.
And that's where things took a really interesting turn.
So what did they find? What did that CT scan show?
Well, the CT scan gave the veterinary team some really important clues. The first thing they noticed was a thickening of the inner table of the skull bone on the right side of the cat's head.
Huh. Okay, so the inner table, that's the layer of bone closest to the brain, right?
That's right. And a thickening in this area, it can suggest some kind of abnormality in the skull itself, possibly in response to changes happening within the brain.
Interesting. And what else did they find?
Well, they also discovered that the cat had an enlarged right frontal sinus.
Okay, so one of the air-filled spaces in the skull.
Exactly. And this enlargement, it could be related to that thickening of the skull bone.
Okay, I'm starting to see the pieces coming together. What happened next?
Now, this is where the findings become even more intriguing. The CT scan revealed a reduction in the volume of the right cranial cavity.
Which is this space within the skull that holds the brain, right?
Precisely. And even more telling, they found that the right forebrain had a reduced volume compared to the left side.
Oh, wow. So the right side of the brain was smaller than the left.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. They also discovered fluid-filled areas in the right frontal and parietal lobes of the brain.
And these areas, they appeared to be connected to an enlarged right lateral ventricle.
You got it.
Hold on just a second. Can you remind me what exactly a ventricle is?
Sure. Ventricles are essentially fluid-filled cavities within the brain, and they play a role in circulating cerebrospinal fluid, which helps to cushion and nourish the brain.
Right, of course. So finding an enlarged ventricle, especially alongside those fluid-filled areas, it suggests that there might be some loss of brain tissue in that region, or that it never fully developed.
That's exactly right.
And to top it all off, the CT scan showed a midline shift of the brain to the right.
Meaning the brain was shifted over to one side.
Likely due to the decreased volume on the right side, right?
Exactly. It paints a pretty clear picture of an asymmetry within the brain.
Wow. Okay. So we have a smaller right side of the brain, a thickened skull, an enlarged sinus, and fluid-filled spaces where brain tissue should be.
And all of these findings, they led the vets to consider a pretty unusual diagnosis.
Let me guess. Dyke-Davidoff-Masson-like syndrome.
You got it.
But before we dive into that, they did one more test. A cerebrospinal fluid analysis, What did that reveal?
The CSF analysis showed a mild increase in certain white blood cells, suggesting that there was some inflammation present.
Interesting. So let's talk about this Dyke-Davidoff-Masson-like syndrome, or DDMS.
Okay.
What exactly is it, and how does it fit into this case?
Well, DDMS is essentially characterized by cerebral hemiatrophy.
Meaning one side of the brain is smaller than the other.
Right. And it's typically caused by a brain injury early in life, which leads to the underdevelopment of one side of the brain.
Okay, so the smaller right side of the brain in this cat aligns with the characteristics of DDMS. But if you remember, this cat was already an adult when these symptoms started. And that's not typical for DDM, is it?
You're absolutely right. That's the million-dollar question. Why would a cat develop symptoms of a developmental brain condition so late in life? It's a real puzzle. And to make things even more interesting, 4 weeks after those initial symptoms, the cat had a seizure. And then, 7 weeks after that first visit, he underwent an MRI.
Ah, the MRI. So they could get a really clear picture of what was going on in the brain.
Exactly. The MRI findings essentially confirmed what the CT scan had already shown, but with much greater detail.
So what did those MRI findings show? What were the key takeaways?
Well, the MRI really highlighted just how underdeveloped the right cerebral hemisphere was. It wasn't just a small difference. The right side was significantly smaller than the left. And this wasn't limited to the cerebrum either. The right diencephalon and mesencephalon, other important parts of the brain, were also noticeably smaller.
Wow, so it wasn't just one area, but multiple parts of the brain that were affected. That really emphasizes the complexity of this case.
Absolutely. The MRI also confirmed that enlargement of the subarachnoid space on the right side of the brain, further supporting the idea that there was a lack of brain tissue in that area, either because it was missing or had never fully developed.
It's like all the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fit together.
Exactly. And speaking of puzzle pieces, let's go back to those ventricles we talked about earlier. The MRI confirmed that the right lateral ventricle was dilated.
Meaning it was enlarged.
Right. And this, along with the lack of brain tissue in the surrounding areas, really pointed towards DDMS.
So the ventricle was expanding to fill the space where brain tissue should have been.
That's a great way to think about it. Now, the MRI also showed something else interesting. Moderate thickening of several bones in the skull, including the frontal bone, parts of the temporal and parietal bones, and a structure called the tentorium cerebelloceum. And this thickening was associated with a wider diploic space.
Okay, so the inner part of the skull was thicker, but the structure of the bone itself was also different.
Precisely. This finding suggests that this brain malformation had been present for a very long time, likely since the cat was very young. Essentially, the skull had adapted to accommodate the smaller size of the right side of the brain.
It's amazing how the body can adapt, even to these significant developmental differences.
It really is. The MRI also helped to rule out other possible causes of the cat symptoms. For example, it showed no signs of any tumors or masses, which was really important information.
So it was a process of elimination, carefully ruling out other potential diagnoses to arrive at the most likely explanation, DDMS.
Exactly. But the big question remained, why did this cat, who likely had this brain malformation his whole life, suddenly start showing these severe neurological symptoms as an adult? Why now?
That's the million-dollar question.
And that's where the cerebrospinal fluid analysis becomes really important.
You mean the one that showed a mild mononuclear pleocytosis?
That's the one.
I'm needing a little refresher on what that means.
Of course. Pleocytosis simply means there's an increased number of cells in the cerebrospinal fluid. In this case, there was an increase in mononuclear cells, which are a type of white blood cell.
And those cells are associated with?
Inflammation.
Right, inflammation. So we have inflammation in the brain on top of this pre-existing brain malformation.
Exactly. Now, imagine this. The cat has been living with this smaller right side of his brain his entire life. He's adapted, his body has compensated.
But then something happens, and even a mild inflammatory event could be enough to disrupt that balance that the cat has been maintaining.
You're getting it. It could be the trigger that finally leads to those more obvious neurological symptoms. Now, there's another point I think is worth discussing. We've been talking about how this cat's case is a bit different from what we typically see in humans with DDMS. For example, in humans, craniofacial asymmetry is common. But that wasn't observed in either of the reported cat cases. What do you make of that?
It does make you wonder, why wouldn't we see similar facial asymmetry in cats if the underlying condition is similar?
It's a great question, and it really highlights the importance of considering species differences, even when we're dealing with conditions that seem to be the same. One possible explanation could be the differences in the blood supply to the head and facial region between cats and humans.
So how could that affect the development of facial features?
Well, think of the blood vessels as a network of roads that deliver nutrients and oxygen to the developing tissues. If there's a disruption in that network, maybe because of a brain injury early on, it can affect how those facial structures develop and grow.
So a brain injury, even if it's very early in development, can have a lasting impact on the development of the face.
Exactly. And because the layout of those blood vessels, those roads, is different between cats and humans, the impact of a similar brain injury might manifest differently. In other words, it might not always show up as facial asymmetry in cats.
So the fact that we don't see facial asymmetry in these cat cases doesn't necessarily mean their condition is less severe or that the mechanisms are completely different. It could just be a reflection of how cats develop.
Right. It really underscores the point that while we can learn from human medicine, we have to remember that animals are not just small humans. Each species has its own unique aspects.
That's a really important reminder. This case has been incredibly enlightening. It seems like we've learned quite a bit about DDMS in both cats and humans.
We have.
All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into this really fascinating case of DDMS in a cat. We've talked about the cat symptoms and the whole diagnostic process, those incredible MRI findings, and we even explored some possible reasons why this cat suddenly started showing such severe neurological problems as an adult. But now I'm really curious about the bigger picture here. Like, what can we learn from this unusual presentation of DDMS? And how might it change how we approach veterinary neurology in the future?
You know, this case really emphasizes how important it is to keep an open mind when we're dealing with neurological cases. Especially in adult animals, we need to be willing to consider diagnoses that might be a little less common.
Yeah, it's like that saying, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. But sometimes it really is a zebra.
Exactly. And this cat is a perfect example of that. If the vets had just brushed off his clumsiness as nothing or assumed his problems were just because he was getting older, they might have completely missed the underlying DDMS.
It just goes to show how valuable a thorough diagnostic approach can be, especially those advanced imaging techniques like MRI. They were able to actually see the changes in the brain and rule out other things that could have been going on.
You're absolutely right. And we can't forget about the importance of that cerebrospinal fluid analysis. That was a key piece of the puzzle because it showed that there was inflammation present, which could have been what triggered this whole cascade of symptoms.
It's like you need all the pieces to see the whole picture, right?
That's a great way to put it. Now, beyond the diagnostic lessons, I think this case also adds to our understanding of DDMS itself. It challenges the way we typically think about the condition.
Because we usually associate DDMS with a brain injury that happens early in life. Right. So seeing it show up so dramatically in an adult cat definitely makes you rethink things.
Right. It suggests that there might be more to DDMS than we initially thought. Maybe there are more subtle versions of the condition that go unnoticed for years and only become obvious when something else happens, like inflammation or some other neurological event.
So this case study could actually lead to new research into the different ways DDMS can present, not just in cats, but in other species as well.
I think that's very possible. And it might also encourage vets to consider DDMS as a possibility even in adult animals, especially if they have a history of clumsiness or other neurological signs earlier in life.
That's fascinating. This case has really broadened our understanding of DDMS and what it means for veterinary neurology. Before we wrap things up, are there any other key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that both vets and pet owners need to pay close attention to any changes in their animal's behavior, even if they seem small. And if something doesn't seem right, it's crucial to be proactive and get a thorough diagnosis. Early detection and treatment can make a huge difference.
That's such an important message. This case really shows what can happen when you're curious, observant, and willing to consider all the possibilities, even the unusual ones. It reminds us that we're constantly learning and discovering new things in veterinary medicine. And cases like this one, where our assumptions are challenged, really push us to improve our understanding and provide the best possible care for our animal patients.
Well said. Cases like this are what keep pushing the boundaries of veterinary neurology and expanding our knowledge.
And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dives into this incredible case of feline DDMS. From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.